Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. This is Five Mistakes Chambers Make with Their Legislative Agenda. I'm Brian Francis. I'm the president of Lumen Strategies. So Lumen Strategies, we work with chambers of commerce to empower them to be the voice for business in their community. And we really help in three ways. One is through our direct consulting with chambers. We basically serve as an outsourced director of public policy for you. We also have our signature online advocacy framework class where we teach you everything that you need to know over the course of a year to implement a legislative agenda and a full public policy program. And then the third thing we do is provide free resources to chamber professionals on a regular basis, things like these webinars. And if you want to go back and see any of our past webinars, we're going to put a link in the chat for you to check those out. We're also this month doing 30 tips or 31 days, excuse me, of legislative advocacy tips on my LinkedIn profile. And so we're also going to give you a link to that LinkedIn profile if you would like to go check those out. We not only have tips, but we have connections to all sorts of resources. Our team is Sarah Principe, who is on the call with us today. She's our advocacy strategist working with chambers of commerce to help implement public policy programs. Myself, Brittany Burton, who's not able to join us today. She's our online learning strategist. She works with all the nuts and bolts of our online advocacy framework program. We also have Jack Francis, who is interning with us this summer. Yes, there is a relation. He is my son. He is attending Butler University in Indianapolis as a strategic communications major. So let's level set before we get going. When we say legislative agenda, let's make sure we all know what we're talking about. So your legislative agenda is literally the document that describes your chamber's public policy positions. It's not your chamber's overall mission statement. It's not what you think you're interested in the community. It needs to be written down, and it needs to be focusing on three levels of government, local, state, and federal. And we would say most on the state level. We'll get into some of the reasons why throughout the course of this webinar. But we really believe that's the place where you have the most opportunity to impact what is going on in the public policy arena and what is impacting your members in that arena. So let's start with the five mistakes that chambers make. And the first mistake is very simply, they have no legislative agenda. I think many of you have heard this term. It's been kind of out there in the chamber lexicon for a while now, and that is that they are parties, parades, and pageants chambers. And if you think about, the evolution of chambers, when chambers of commerce were started, they were really started as advocacy organizations, opportunities for business folks to come together to improve their community. And oftentimes that improvement required either policy decisions at the local level or state level or ultimately at the federal level. And I thought this was a great observation. As I mentioned to some folks earlier, I was with the Georgia Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives last week, and Chris Clark, the president and CEO of the Georgia Chamber, made this observation. It's literally in your tax status that you are an advocacy organization. Just about every chamber that we're aware of out there is operating as a 501c6, not a 501c3. And the reason you're a 501c6 is that gives you the flexibility to advocate on public policy proposals. So that would be the first mistake. And what we would suggest as to how to correct those, the very first thing is to have a discussion with your board about being the voice for business in your community. We actually have a PowerPoint that we can share with you. If you'll let us know you need it, we'll send it out to you. That basically walks you through the conversation with your board and about how you can share with your board. This isn't about the chamber being political. It's about the chamber getting involved in policy. And that is ultimately one of the reasons that the chamber exists, one of the main reasons. And so we talked about those parties, parades, and pageants. And the alternate to that is being a chamber that is a catalyst, a convener, and like Rocky, a champion. If you want to be that catalyst, convener, and champion, it's really important that you know what you are trying to advance, and working on your legislative agenda is how you do that. Now, mistake number two that we see people make is that their legislative agenda is not member driven, but rather staff created or kind of just technical term loosey-goosey. It's put together without a whole lot of process. Here's one of the things many of you probably heard when you're a chamber executive, you want to put a volunteer between you and the problem. And that's certainly true with a legislative agenda. No matter how much work you put into getting member input, at some point, somebody, either an elected official or a member of the community, or even a member of your chamber, is not going to be happy about something that's in your legislative agenda. And if you have not used your members to create that agenda, that fire is all going to fall on you. And so from a chamber executive perspective, we think it's really important. We'll talk a little bit more about how you correct this and why. But the other thing I wanted to mention that we often see chambers doing that is really a mistake is that you simply adopt somebody else's agenda. And most commonly, this is the state chamber for your state. And we work with a lot of state chambers and we love state chambers. By its very nature, if you are simply adopting the state chamber's legislative agenda, you're missing the local issues that are important to your community. And quite frankly, if something's on the state chamber's agenda, they're working on it already. And you really want to identify some issues that you can bring unique value towards the advocacy. Now, how do you correct that problem? The first I would say is you need to have a policy committee. Many folks have a policy committee, but they'll tell you it's not that active, or they just don't have one at all, or they once had one and they still have a roster, but it never meets. What we're really looking for you to do is get an active policy committee together that goes through a very specific process towards building a legislative agenda. Your committee, you want to be very business focused. And so you really need to limit the number of nonprofit members you have sharing on that. Quite frankly, nonprofits just operate differently. They have different priorities. And if you want to be the voice for business and not the voice for nonprofits in your community, you have to have business people on your committee. You don't want elected officials on your committee. And this oftentimes is a difficult one, especially because, and this is a good thing, sometimes those elected officials are chamber members, and oftentimes those are chamber members who were active in public policy within your chamber and have gone on to be an elected official. But ultimately, in their role as an elected official, they have multiple constituencies that they are serving. And so they have political considerations that they are making that may not align perfectly with those that the chamber is advocating. And so you don't necessarily want them on your committee. Now, talking about the process that you want to go through, you want to survey all of your members. We all have done surveys and we know that the response rate is not always that great, but you at least want to give people the opportunity to weigh in. And you'll identify perhaps some challenges that are out there that maybe you weren't aware of. But you also want to have roundtable discussions with your committee and with other members to really just ask them, what is going on from a government, legislative, bureaucratic sense that's hurting your business or preventing your business from being as great as it can? And that's really where you start with those, identifying those issues. And then you want to also have a specific process that you go through. So you want your committee to ultimately come together recommending your legislative agenda. You want your XCOM, if you have one, to review it, and you want your board to ultimately adopt it. And then when somebody comes to you and questions why something is in your agenda, again, it's not the president's agenda or the executive director's agenda, but it is the chamber's agenda. And it was vetted and created by members. It was approved by your governing body and has broad support. The last thing I'll mention with this picture on this slide, do not be intimidated by that. You do not need that many people on your committee, nor do you need a conference table that big. But really getting started with even just 8 to 10 members is a great place to get started. We have a lot of ideas on how you can put together that committee. We actually have a free lesson on our website that walks you through that if you want to check that out. Now, mistake number 3 that we often see is chambers trying to do too much. And it's kind of ironic. Oftentimes, having a really long, really robust legislative agenda is a sign that you don't have a really strong process. We work with some chambers, and oftentimes when we come in, we see kind of 2 things. Either they don't have an agenda at all, or maybe they have an agenda that has 40 or 50 items on it. And the reality is you can't work on that many items, and legislators can't comprehend that many items. And so if you hand them a document that has a ton of items on it, that laundry list that you see on that bullet point, they're not going to be able to do anything about it. The other thing that we see is people focusing on the really big issues where they have little influence. Oftentimes those are federal issues. The federal government is just so hard. It's the big battleship that's hard to move, and it's hard for one local chamber to make a lot of influence on a federal issue. If you are going to get involved in a federal issue, oftentimes it's good to get involved in something that's very specific to your community. For instance, if you have a military base in your community and you want to advocate for, additional resources for that base, that can be great. Or if there's a specific bridge in your community, there are folks down in Wilmington, North Carolina are really excited. They just got a new bridge announced. That's a great thing to work on at the federal level, but those big, broad issues can be hard to influence. And then the other thing I would say, I mentioned that laundry list, and we'll often also see chambers that, have some advocacy program, and they put together a really big, long booklet that has contact information for all their legislators and a bunch of legislative issues. And that's just really not a great advocacy piece. So what should you do instead? One, we think you should focus on state and local issues. Again, we've mentioned state issues. I really think that's a sweet spot because you do have access to your state representatives, your state senators. There isn't so much in most states going on that you can't get in and influence those policies, particularly if you partner with other chambers in your state to work on things. Also, local issues, obviously very important. One of the things we see with local issues, they don't always lend themselves great to a legislative agenda because oftentimes there's not that long process. More likely, local issues are ad hoc. Decisions get made quickly and over coffee. Whereas with the state system, you typically have a process of a bill introduction timeline, a crossover deadline in many states, several months of legislative action where things have to go through committee, go to the floor, go to the other house, et cetera. So there's a lot more opportunities to impact the process at the state level. Again, we want you to limit your specific requests. 7 to 10 legislative action items is probably a good amount. Once you get more than that, it makes it hard for your delegation to really know what it is you're working on. Another is to know the win. A lot of times chambers will put something on the legislative agenda and they'll actually accomplish it and they won't realize that they did because it maybe didn't happen exactly how they wanted. So we think it's really important to celebrate those wins and know what you're trying to accomplish. And then finally, I'd say tailor your communications to your audiences. Something that is going to a legislative staff person probably needs to be a little bit more detailed. They get into the weeds of policy, whereas when you're sharing with an elected official, you really want that short 1 or 2 sentence description of the problem and the solution that you're proposing. Mistake number 4, I would say, kind of ironically, the opposite of the last one, and that is being too precise. So the first thing that I would say is you, in addition to having those 7 to 10 specific legislative items, should have a couple of guiding principles. Those are your overarching statements that basically say, hey, we support less, regulation, or we support lower taxes, or we support improvements in the childcare system. You're not advocating for a specific tax to be reduced or a specific regulation, but you're giving yourself the flexibility that when somebody comes to you and says, what does the chamber think about this? You have a member-driven process that frames your answer. Well, we may never have talked about that regulation specifically, but our committee did decide that we generally oppose new regulation on business, and so we would likely oppose that new regulation. Another problem I see a lot of people make, and a lot of government affairs people do this too, they'll talk about a specific bill and they'll say, we support House Bill 123. And the problem with that is in many legislative bodies, House Bill 123 is going to change several times between when it's introduced and when it's passed. And so you don't want your legislative agenda to say you support a bill because by the time somebody's reading your legislative agenda, that bill may be something entirely different than what you thought about when you created your agenda. So talk about what the policy is that you want as opposed to the bill. The other one I would say is endorsing other organizations' agendas, and in this way, saying, we support we support the legislative agenda of Forward Georgia, whatever Forward Georgia might be. And the problem with that is at some point in the future, Forward Georgia may adopt a legislative position that you don't agree with. And now you have it in your agenda that you support their agenda, and you didn't really know what you were ultimately supporting. And then finally, I'd say being so specific that you leave no room for compromise. If you put on your legislative agenda that you want the corporate tax rate lowered to 5%, and let's say it's currently 6%, and the legislature comes with a proposal to lower it to 5.25%, are you going to oppose that because it doesn't meet what you said you wanted in your agenda? I would suggest talk about things in generalities, even when you're getting into a specific item. And let me kind of try to work through that nuance. You may want to say you specifically support lowering the corporate income tax. So you're getting specific enough to talk about which tax you're talking about. But when you talk about lowering it, you don't talk about a specific number, but generally just that you would like to see it move lower. So I got into all my corrections during my mistake slide, but you'll see here, guiding principles, support policies, not necessarily bill numbers. The last thing I'll mention is know your role on each legislative agenda item. Are you supporting something that somebody else is taking the lead on? And this is a great way to get involved in federal issues. If the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is working on an issue, you might want to lend your support to their letter to Congress members saying, yeah, we too support this initiative, even though the U.S. Chamber is doing all the work on it, we are supportive of the work that they're doing. You might be part of a coalition, and this we've seen work really well, where particularly on the state level, if you can get, 50 chambers at the local level to come together to work together on an issue, and each of you has the responsibility for communicating with your own legislator. Maybe one coalition member has the responsibility for drafting the letter that you're going to send to everybody. Somebody else is doing some of the research on it. Somebody else is coordinating all the signees, but ultimately each of you is sending the letter to your representative. That is a great way to move policy forward. And then the third is the lead. So this is the item that if your chamber is not advocating for it, nobody is advocating for it. Oftentimes we'll see this with local road projects or a local occupancy tax or a local bond referendum. And just know that when you're the lead, you need to be doing a lot of the work and looking for other people to support you, but ultimately you are the one who's driving the decision-making and the messaging. And finally, mistake number 5, adopt and stop. A lot of times you'll ask chambers, do you have a legislative agenda? Oh yeah, it's on our website. Okay, what have you done with it? Well, we adopted it, and that was kind of the last we really talked about it. So how do you correct this? There are a bunch of ways that you need to be out promoting your legislative agenda. You can hold a legislative breakfast where you're communicating your agenda both to your members and to your elected officials. You can write an op-ed for your local newspaper or blog posts for your website. You can do a state capitol visit where you take, at first I often say, just take yourself or yourself and your chair and go see your legislators at the Capitol. In most states, the Capitol's not more than a day's drive. Some of the bigger states, you might have to stay over, but that's legislators love to see when their constituents make the effort to go to the Capitol to see them. And it's just, the conversations hit a little bit different when you're having them there than when you're having them at home. And then finally, keep a scorecard. Know at the end of your session, did you succeed on your items? And if you did, brag about that to your members. If you didn't, figure out what happened and if it's something that you can continue to work on. Some chambers go so far as to also score their legislators, and were their legislators supportive of the things that they are working. That's really kind of getting that's getting far down the road. If you don't have a legislative agenda program, that's not where you start. But if you have one and you've been going for a while, that might be a next logical step for you. So just to recap, our 5 mistakes: no agenda, not member driven, either too broad or too specific. We're really looking for that Goldilocks agenda, and then adopt and stop. So just real quickly, I mentioned at the top, we have an advocacy framework program. It's an online program where we have more than 25 lessons pre-recorded. Each lesson comes with some downloads, some tools that you can use to implement a program. We also do group coaching, and we would love to talk to you more about that, or really about anything that you're interested in talking about with your advocacy program. I just love chamber advocacy. I love hearing from chambers about what they're doing and what challenges they face. And if you ever be interested in doing that, you can either scan the QR code there to get all my contact information. I think we've also put a link in the chat for to schedule a meeting with me, and we would love to talk to you. Anybody have any questions today?
I did have one question.
Yeah.
You mentioned not having elected officials as part of your public policy committee. So we invite our local delegation. They primarily serve Morgan County, the county that we're in, little part of another county, one of them that is the strongest senator in our state. He lives in Morgan County. He brings a lot of resources back to Decatur, Morgan County, a lot. So thoughts about that?
Yeah, so, and thank you for asking that, and let me try to clarify that. So when I'm talking about a public policy committee, I'm really talking about the group that is being your decision-making body, right? And so let me give an example, and not knowing the politics of your chamber necessarily, or policy positions of your chamber, or the politics of your senator. Let's say the most important thing for you all was a bill on bringing health insurance options to small businesses. And for whatever reason, that senator was fighting that. Obviously that's not a great position to be in, but that is a position where you still need to advocate for your members. And if he wants to disagree with that, you can have that disagreement during the policy advocacy portion, but you don't want him advocating to your committee to keep that item off of your legislative agenda because it's going to be politically difficult for him. I do think, though, that it's very important that you stay in close contact with your delegation. You want them calling you, getting your opinions. You want them sharing what they're working on. And if they need your help in pushing something, you want that to happen. I just suggest that there are two different forums for that to happen. And so one way that I think you can address that is you can have committee working meetings where you do not bring in the delegation, but then also information sharing meetings. And I would actually not even call them necessarily policy committee meetings. I would come up with some other terms, maybe in a quarterly elected officials roundtable, and bring those folks in. And one of the things I would say with that is I would then also, if they're willing to do it, broaden the group of members that you invite to that and give more of your members access to those elected officials as a way to bring member value to them.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a quick question. When you said if your agenda is actually more of a marketing piece for your members rather than lawmakers, if you felt like your agenda was that way, or you wanted to move towards making it more lawmaker focused, how would you do that?
Yeah, and I think you can. So if that long piece is a good marketing piece for you, certainly keep doing it. But also for your members, I would say have one sheet of paper, preferably just one side. I'll let you go front and back if you have to, but just with those specific legislative agenda items on them. And that way, when you're having the conversation with the legislator, and I would even call it out to them like, hey, in the past, we might have come to you with this big book that talks about all the different things we want to do. We're trying to get really focused. These are the 6 or 7 items we're working on during this legislative session. Let's talk about each of them. And here's another thing I always like to do is put them on the spot a little. Which of these would you be interested in sponsoring? Or which of these do you want to be a lead legislator on? Because we would love to have you introduce a bill that would address this.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, if there are no other questions, we will let you move forward with the rest of your day. I appreciate you all joining us today. And again, would love to talk to you all about your advocacy programs if you are ever interested in doing so. Take care, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.